Yeah, real man. Poetry for real men. I brooded that real men do not read poetry. They told me so at school when they were 17, and again in blue-tied offices, in sweaty fields, in tarmacked yards and jukebox pubs since. And from their actions I knew they weren't lying. Painful as it was to me in my alchemical quest to find and to shine the poetry-loving jewel in every soul, it had to be admitted that they spoke the truth and had no secret stashes of slim volumes, no private grand obsession with the muse. Even Jimmy Greaves, who was surely a real man, and who spoke so often of football as sheer poetry, even he never furtively read Blake and Don Marquis when the wife and kids were out for the day. Very well then. If real men would not lean towards poetry, then why should not poetry lean towards them? High up in my poetic eyrie, I let my eyes roam across the vital apparatus, the flasks and tubes brimming with every ingredient, and a new idea formed there and then. Poetry for real men. Slowly at first I assembled the parts, the metal, the fibre, the slime and the bone, the hot spitting fire of the caustic and acid, then switched on the power in a shower of sparks, sent the hot blood like liquid darts coursing through the twitching arteries of the golem on the slab, and the spirit of poetry for real men rose up, and I cried out, "It lives!" And the spirit belched once and said, "What gives?" I said, "Tell me, O Spirit, all about yourself. Tell me about what will draw real men to the poetry shelf." And the Spirit said, "Son, what you need is the facts. And I've got what you need to make that poetry succeed. Is its voice like an angel or like a thunderstorm? Does it come in splash-on form? Yes, in splash-on form with that great, great smell. Well, listen, son, and I will tell, for real men will want to know all of the jam on poetry for real men. Poetry for real men should play football like sheer poetry, naturally, and should itself be poetry that is sheer football. Poetry for real men should gaze with adoring eyes and tell every real man in the whole world that he is the only really real man in the whole world, but should not demand long-term commitment. Poetry for real men should be just like a real woman, the sort with big tits that shags. But mostly it should be just like a real man, the sort with hard cash and hard head. Poetry for real men should not, however, be both of these in the same poem, because any poem which changes its sex cannot possibly be poetry for real men. Real men don't want any Nancy come Ben in their poetry for real men. Poetry for real men is poetry that knows how to use its hands, poetry that knows where its wife belongs, poetry that can handle itself in a tight spot, poetry that knows how to work a good fiddle, poetry that knows how to pass on the blame should it ever come close to getting caught, poetry that can brag about the size of its todger and is never at a loss for where to put it. For as poetry for real men frequently points out, real women always say yes to poetry for real men. Poetry that is generous to its friends but not shy to use its fists if ever someone should step out of line. Poetry that fills in quizzes about its mates and scores its best ones out of 10 and always gives the highest scores to real men who want poetry for real men. Poetry for real men tells you its life story in punchy, medal-sized anecdotes. Poetry for real men is keen to remind you that this is the real world we are living in. Poetry for real men often begins sentences with words like "I'm not racist, but..." And you will know by its firm, dry handshake that you are shaking hands with poetry for real men. Poetry for real men went to the University of Life and before that the School of Hard Knocks. Poetry for real men prays to God that its enemies be delivered into its hands. Poetry for real men can drink 10 pints without being sick until it reaches the curry house and has no time for losers. It's poem eats poem in a rough, tough world, and it's a rough, tough world we're living in, baby. So pick up the sword, put down the pen, says poetry for real men. I brooded that real men do not read poetry. I preached the unknown heavens for a happy solution. But the muses must have all took off on an away day, because when I looked on my creation, it was not good. And damned if the answer I came up with didn't turn out just like Frankenstein's monster all over again. Poetry for real men.